those two aren't good companions. He continued only after a pause. Even if Shizun doesn't want to stay with me, I hope he wouldn't associate with them. It sounded like this wasn't Luo Binghe's first rendezvous with Tianlangjun and Zhu Zilang. You've met them before? Shen Qingqiu asked. I engaged that snake on the southern border, Luo Binghe said mildly. We fought a few times, and he nearly got the better of me. I've never seen the other one before, but I couldn't defeat him. Zhu Zilang was from the southern border, so he'd naturally be at his best in that environment. Tianlangjun had said that the Jinglan city plague was originally wrought to resolve a food shortage in that territory. It was to be expected that Luo Binghe might have fought Zhu Zilang there. But it seemed that Zhu Zilang had never explained his identity to Luo Binghe, nor had he treated him as a young master of the family. Tianlangjun didn't seem inclined to do so either. So it looked like neither the father nor the cousin had any intention of acknowledging Luo Binghe. Though Luo Binghe's stride was steady, he walked with a faint limp, but he kept his back straight, and he didn't use the wall to support himself. Shen Qingqiu felt mixed emotions at the sight of this. After awkwardly hesitating for a moment, he steeled his resolve and stepped forward to support Luo Binghe. Just then, the candle suddenly flickered, the tomb corridor dimmed, and Luo Binghe loomed over him. However, this time, Luo Binghe didn't pull him into a forceful embrace, nor did he get handsy. He just completely collapsed onto Shen Qingqiu and then didn't move a mote. After so long running every which way, Shen Qingqiu was also utterly exhausted. Unable to support the weight of two people, he slammed into the stone wall with a thud. Luo Binghe fell sideways into him, all limp, and his head cracked against the wall, letting out a loud thunk. Shen Qingqiu's heart clenched along with the noise, his gums aching in sympathy. He rapidly got to his feet and put his arms around Luo Binghe, patting around until his hands reached Luo Binghe's back. The clothes across that back were ragged, corroded through by the corpse rain in the Hall of Sorrow. When Shen Qingqiu reached further, he found that the texture of the skin underneath that clothing was all wrong, as if rotting. It was already beginning to smell. After all, there was nothing good about corpse rain. When no one else was around, Shen Qingqiu's preferred method of waking up other men was to give them 2 light slaps to the face. But before he had even extended his hands, he figured he couldn't bear to do it, so instead he lightly patted Luo Binghe's cheek, subconsciously also lowering his voice. Luo Binghe, Luo Binghe. But Luo Binghe's eyelids were so heavy that his lashes didn't so much as tremble. In addition, his face was still flushed and abnormal red. When Shen Qingqiu reached up to touch it, both his forehead and cheeks were scalding hot, as if he had a fever. However, Luo Binghe's body shouldn't even have known the concept of, quote, fever. Even if he occasionally ended up in dire straits, it never lasted long, nor would it get so bad that he lost consciousness. When Shen Qingqiu reached down to touch Luo Binghe's hands, they were ice cold. It was like his head was in a furnace while the rest of his body was in a freezer. Shen Qingqiu put one hand on the back of Luo Binghe's head, rubbing the place where it had crashed into the wall. Binghe, can you hear me? No response. Shen Qingqiu counted up the causes. In order to protect Shen Qingqiu's body and prevent it from withering, Luo Binghe had exhausted several days' worth of spiritual energy, but in the end, he'd still failed. Then he'd gone around catching all those black moon rhinoceros pythons. After that, he'd come to the holy mausoleum. Tianlangjun had beaten him up, and he'd been assaulted by the sound attack in the Hall of Delight. Then Tianlangjun had continued beating him up, and finally He'd been soaked in corpse's rain. No matter how you looked at it, it was much more serious than a fever. After Luo Binghe passed out, his presence lost its suppressive effect, and the blind corpses that had retreated into the shadows began to stir again, coming to surround them as hissing groans escaped their throats. Shen Qingqiu held Luo Binghe's limp body with one hand and Xiaoya's sword with the other. With a whip of his arm, the sword flew from its sheath like an arrow and stabbed through a dozen corpses on its first sweep. However, the snow-bright blade caught light very well, and when the green glow of the last breath candles reflected off the sword, its glint grew even more piercing. Between the blind corpses' hypersensitivity to light and their quick dodges, this trick wouldn't work a second time. Right after Shen Qingqiu returned the sword to its sheath at his waist, several withered hands reached for him, and one even went for Luo Binghe's eyes. Shen Qingqiu swept out with a spiritual blast, bursting that unruly blind corpse's head into confetti. But though spiritual blasts were an effective maneuver, one couldn't rely on them exclusively. They expended too much spiritual energy, and before long your stores would run dry. In addition, Shen Qingqiu had returned his original state where he had, quote, 2 bars of battery, unquote. He couldn't be as unrestrained as with his Jew mushroom body form. After releasing 20 or so attacks, he felt himself waning slightly. The blind corpses jostled back and forth in the corridor, and he could only kick them away one by one. Though these monsters were low level, they never stopped coming, and he was holding a woozy Luo Binghe. As he was sent staggering, his grip slipped for a moment, and Luo Binghe's head crashed into the stone wall again. That thunk sounded especially painful. Shen Qingqiu guiltily cradled the back of Luo Binghe's head in his hand. Touching it again and again, he kept feeling like a giant lump had begun to swell there. First a fever and now a bump. Let's not give this child brain damage, okay? Weak mobs were still troublesome, and staying in this tomb corridor full of last breath candles would only attract endless waves of blind corpses. Shen Qingqiu changed positions and hauled an arm of Luo Binghe's over his shoulder, then bolted away, dragging him along like a comet trailing its tail. He left the blind corpses several meters behind, but his hurried breaths made the last breath candles light up one after another, cloaking them in an inescapable glow. Though the blind corpses couldn't catch up, he couldn't lose them either, and they were dogged in their pursuit, until Shen Qingqiu passed a small chamber as he turned a corner. This might have been a preparation chamber. Coffins were scattered throughout the room in disarray, and the lids of some of them had been overturned onto the floor. The resulting atmosphere were neither serious nor solemn. Shen Qingqiu quickly dragged Luo Binghe inside, checking the coffins one by one. Some contained withered corpses lying in strange positions, but some were empty. The hissing outside the chamber grew closer and closer, and long wavering shadows weaved wildly on the floor. As the situation was getting serious, Shen Qingqiu leapt into a stone coffin. He had wanted to stuff Luo Binghe into another one, but there was no time. They tumbled into the same casket, entangled together. Even though a layer of soft material padded the bottom, when Shen Qingqiu slammed down inside, stars filled his vision. Luo Binghe was on top, and Shen Qingqiu was on the bottom, so he was smooshed under a considerable weight and almost unable to draw another breath. What has this child been eating? He looked quite slim, so how was he this heavy? Furthermore, the lid of the coffin was only shut halfway. Shen Qingqiu was about to reach out to close it when the green light outside flickered and several stooped black shadows appeared on the ceiling. The blind corpses had come inside. They shuffled into the preparation chamber, making the occasionally quiet tap against the furnishings, as well as rasping their sharp fingernails on the stone coffins. The result was blood-curdlingly eerie. If there was any place that was definitely without last breath candles, it was the coffin interiors. As long as no light source appeared, those blind fools would be unable to catch them. Shen Qingqiu stayed calm and laid there, facing up. Luo Binghe was on top of him, facing down, his head buried in the crook of Shen Qingqiu's shoulder, an uncomfortable heat against his neck. If even Shen Qingqiu was uncomfortable, Luo Binghe had to be even more so. Luo Binghe's hands were freezing while his head was hot, so Shen Qingqiu figured he might as well use Luo Binghe's hands to cool his forehead. While he thought this was a good idea, just as he was about to grab Luo Binghe's wrist, his entire body froze. 5 bone-thin fingers with long claw-like fingernails appeared above the coffin. Why was their search so meticulous? Wasn't the IQ of blind corpses supposed to be super low? Didn't these things entirely ignore anything that didn't give off light? Shen Qingqiu suddenly realized that next to his cheek, something really was giving off a dim red glow. When he looked, though Luo Binghe's eyes were closed, the heavenly demon mark of sin had appeared on his forehead, lines of crimson pulsing along his breasts. The red glow flickered on and off along with it. Though Shen Qingqiu knew this mark of sin was the manifestation of the bloodline's fall from the heavens, he didn't think it needed to be so bright, did it? Why did it look like that thing on Ultraman's chest that flashed on and off whenever he was at the end of a fight and nearly out of battery? Shen Qingqiu couldn't spare a hand to cover that damnable mark, so before he could even think, he turned his head and pressed the side of his mouth against that smooth forehead. It looked a bit like he was kissing Luo Binghe's brow. But don't mind the details, these are extenuating circumstances. Survival comes first. That spindly hand entangled a few strands of hair, its fingernails clogged with muck, and reached tremblingly into the stone coffin to grope all around. The casket was narrow but deep, and as long as it only felt around within the upper range, it wouldn't touch the 2 people lying inside. But this hand had absolutely no sense of restraint. As it reached deeper and deeper, Shen Qingqiu's heart rose higher and higher in his throat. Just as it was about to touch Luo Binghe's spine, Shen Qingqiu gritted his teeth, extracted his right arm, which was going numb from the weight, and found a mostly intact place on Luo Binghe's back to pull him further down. Now, Luo Binghe's whole upper torso was entirely pressed to his. There had been a gap between them before, but now they had become practically interlocked, chest to chest, abdomen to abdomen. A person's abdomen is supposed to be the softest spot on their body, but Luo Binghe's was uncomfortably hard against Shen Qingqiu's stomach. The further down he pulled him, the more he was sure that Luo Binghe had an 8-pack. Was that a rock slab down there? Though the hand stopped searching down just barely before it reached Luo Binghe's back, it changed directions instead and started groping in the other direction. As it was about to touch Luo Binghe's calves, Shen Qingqiu steeled himself and spread his legs, letting Luo Binghe's left leg fall between the 2 of his. He had already minimized the space the 2 of them took up as much as he could. He really couldn't make them any smaller. That blind corpse's trembling hand continued to feel about for a while. Finding nothing at all, it slowly withdrew. Only after all the blind corpses left the preparation chamber with dissatisfied rumbles, milling off into the distance, did Shen Qingqiu finally let out a sigh of relief. Their current position was entirely too improper. If someone looked inside the coffin at that moment, they'd definitely think Shen Qingqiu was in the throes of lust, clinging to Luo Binghe and refusing to let go, pulling him into his arms as if he wanted to meld their bodies together. He was about to push Luo Binghe into a sitting position when a voice suddenly spoke in the preparation chamber.
It's far too early to relax.
The voice was aged and had a mocking tone. Shen Qingqiu immediately grabbed Xiaoya's sword and flipped himself over, protecting Luo Binghe beneath him as he sat up on full alert, brandishing his sword. "Who is it?" he shouted. The horde of blind corpses had left. This mausoleum chamber was completely empty of anything except the frigid stone coffins filling the room. "Don't tell me another corpse woke up from one of these. I looked through everything and pretty much all of them are dry goods." That voice spoke again.
If this elder wanted to go unseen, even if you searched the entirety of Holy Mausoleum, you wouldn't find him.
Only after these few words did Shen Qingqiu realize that the voice was eminently familiar. He had definitely heard it somewhere before, and more than once. In a sudden flash of realization, he returned his sword to its sheath. Since it's senior Menmo, there's no need to act so cryptic. As soon as the words left his mouth, an old man appeared in the center of the preparation chamber. He wore opulent robes. His gaze was as sharp as a hawk's. He sat cross-legged on one of the coffins, arrogantly looking down at Shen Qingqiu.
"So, you remember this elder?"
"If Senior Menmo has appeared before me, then I must be dreaming," Shen Qingqiu said. Before Menmo had only appeared in dream realms in the form of a cloud of black fog, but now he could manifest a human form. It looked like he had recovered quite well in Luo Binghe's body. But seeing that the newcomer was a portable grandfather who was always on Luo Binghe's side, Shen Qingqiu relaxed. Menmo humphed.
"But your current predicament is no way a dream."
"Could I ask for Senior Menmo's assistance in entering Luo Binghe's dream realm to wake him?" Shen Qingqiu asked.
"I can't wake him."
"Huh?" Shen Qingqiu began to panic, nearly breaking character. "Why not?" he asked. Had the fever already damaged Luo Binghe's brain?
"I can't get in,"
Menmo said mildly.
"Right now, this brat's spirit is in complete chaos. A field of nothingness filled with black fog. He's sunk into a dream from which he cannot wake. This elder has only seen such circumstances within the dream realms of two kinds of people, one of which is the fatally ill, who are close to death."
Wow, none of that sounded like it was anything good. But if the former was the fatally ill on the verge of death, the latter couldn't be worse, right? "And the other?" Shen Qingqiu patiently asked.
"The mentally infirm."
Shen Qingqiu said a lot of nothing.
"The brat brought it on himself,"
Menmo continued, as if speaking to himself.
"In the past 5 years, he wore himself down performing soul-summoning rituals by day while massacring his own dream realm creations by night. This elder told him at the start that this was no different from destroying his own spirit, but he ignored that advice. This day was coming sooner or later. In the past few days, he exhausted his spiritual energy to preserve that Jew mushroom body of yours, and that demonic sword took the opportunity to revolt. Then he barged into the holy mausoleum and went toe-to-toe with the most talented heir to the heavenly demon bloodline in the history of our race."
Shen Qingqiu gripped Xiaoya's sword so hard his hand started to hurt. He looked back at Luo Binghe, lying dead to the world in the stone coffin, and asked, "Senior truly has no way to wake him?"
"I'm powerless to help."
Shen Qingqiu cupped his hands into a bow and silently lay back down in the coffin. Mengmo raised an eyebrow.
What are you doing?
Sleeping. Until I wake up, Shen Qingqiu said. Blue veins popped on Mengmo's forehead.
You dare ignore this elder?
Shen Qingqiu closed his eyes. Since Senior said he was powerless to help, then I can only wait until I wake up and get him out of here myself. Mengmo humphed.
Our race as holy Muslim is forbidden territory full of dangers, and there are 2 troublesome characters lying in wait. You can't protect him alone.
His words were correct. Very correct. Shen Qingqiu opened his eyes again and sighed. But in this moment, other than I, his master, who else can protect him? Or put it another way, who else would protect him? Countless feelings ran through Shen Qingqiu in an endless onslaught, and his emotions were a mess. But he was very clear on one thing. No matter what, he couldn't let Luo Binghe die here.
After so many years, you're finally willing to admit this brat is your disciple, and you are his shizun?
Mengmo said in a cold voice. It's certainly been a long time, Shen Qingqiu said. He was waiting for Mengmo to continue with a snide mockery, but instead the old man suddenly sighed.
If this brat could wake up and hear these words of yours, who knows how overjoyed he'd be.
Gramps, could you not make every one of your words so inauspicious? Shen Qingqiu's face darkened with dismay. What did Mengmo mean if Luo Binghe could wake up? This tone, like the one in question was on the brink of life and death, was only giving Shen Qingqiu even more anxiety, okay? Mengmo was suddenly overcome with rage.
I am clearly this kid's shifu. Just how much have I taught him, huh?
He shouted.
Power to overturn the heavens, techniques to manipulate every heart. Yet he refuses to call me shifu. Senior this and senior that. You, a common cultivator, merely taught him a few superficial forms and half-baked techniques, but he chases after you, crying, yelling, and calling you shizun. It drives me up the wall.
This mass of rage had been building in Mengmo's belly for a while, and the sight of these two lying in the same coffin was even more irritating to his eyes. He was going to go blind. He was extremely unhappy, supremely grouchy. Shen Qingqiu wasn't happy either. He was already upset at the suggestion that Changqiu Mountain's sword techniques were, quote, superficial. He was just about to retort when Mengmo exploded again, pacing back and forth on the coffin with his hands behind his back.
If only I had seamlessly gotten rid of you in the dream realm back then, these complications wouldn't have arisen today. This brat was a moldable talent with incredible potential. But as soon as he met you, he turned into this maddening good-for-nothing, and he still pretends at it when you are around, trying to act all aloof. The way this elder sees it, he should either kill you or do you. Making such a fuss, will he, won't he? It's infuriating, even to watch.
Shen Qingqiu really wished he could cover his ears, or perhaps stitch Mengmo's mouth shut. He shot a glance at Luo Binghe's quietly sleeping visage, the image of his disciple's crying face flashing through his head for a moment before he immediately looked away. Senior, aren't these words a bit inappropriate to say to my face? He snapped, unable to bear it. Are you done? If you are done, can you let me wake up? Mengmo was still angry.
Wake up? You wouldn't know how to get out even if you did wake up. The entrance he opened has already closed.
It might be possible to open it again, Shen Qingqiu said. Senior, please tell me which direction I should head in to find the place where Luo Binghe broke through the barrier using the Black Moon rhinoceros pythons. His gaze landed on Xingmo's sword, which hung at Luo Binghe's waist. The place where he had broken into the mausoleum would still be weak, and if it were slashed once more with Xingmo Sword's dimension-rending abilities, it might open again. Menmo looked in the direction of his gaze and understood his intentions, but remained skeptical.
That sword may not allow you to use it.
Of course, Shen Qingqiu knew that as well. He gritted his teeth. There's no other choice. He said gravely to himself, I have to try. When he woke, he was still lying in the stone coffin, and Luo Binghe was lying on top of him where Shen Qingqiu had left him, held tightly in his embrace. Thank the heavens, the bothersome old gremlin Menmo had finally been willing to release him. Shen Qingqiu was about to sit up when suddenly his right leg seemed to have brushed something stiff that jabbed into the inside of his thigh. At first, Shen Qingqiu thought it was his sword hilt, and he absent-mindedly reached down to move it. But as soon as he touched the object, the system suddenly exploded with messages. Yo! Protagonist satisfaction points plus 1,000. Congratulations! You're unlocking the achievement, quote, physical relationship advancement, unquote. At that moment, Shen Qingqiu also stiffened into a dried husk. The hell did physical relationship advancement mean? When he looked down, this quote, sword hilt, unquote, was in fact something quite impressive. The heavenly pillar! It was the heavenly pillar! Shen Qingqiu was going to kill everyone in this room and then himself. After flailing about for a while, he slapped himself across the face and reasoned himself logically. One couldn't tell day from night in the Holy Mausoleum, so maybe it was morning outside right now. Therefore, this was a natural phenomenon, a normal bodily function. It would go away on its own, right? That was how it usually went, yes, that's right. But just letting it sit there and not doing anything about it, wasn't that a bit pitiful? Well, there was nothing to be done about that. He couldn't exactly help Luo Binghe jerk off under these circumstances, right? If he just pretended he hadn't seen anything, he would probably be forgiven, right?